Hi, I'm Brad, and this channel is all about why I believe in Jesus. I'm just a normal guy, but I just want to discuss why I believe what I believe. So this video is specifically geared towards atheists and agnostics and for followers of Jesus. But it really is talking about observational science and evidential or forensic sciences, and also faith systems. So first of all, I have a great deal of respect for science. I graduated from UT with electrical engineering, emphasis in computer engineering. We wouldn't have cars, computers, modern medicine, telescopes, so many different things without, scientists doing real rigorous scientific work. So I'm in no way against science. But like most things, there's true science, and then there are other things that may look like science, but maybe are something a little bit different. So, for instance, if someone is claiming to be a scientist, and they say that they can prove that they know how to start fires by watching the movement of the stars, we would probably agree that that person wasn't doing real science. So science requires looking at something in our physical world and creating a hypothesis to some type of experimental evidence. So, to determine how fires start, one would need to understand the process, the components required, the initial conditions of the system, etc. Now, that seems pretty simple because we can perform experiments over and over again to determine, how fires get started. In fact, that's kind of precisely the idea, right, behind the scientific method. In the scientific method, somebody first makes an observation that describes a problem. They make a hypothesis and some predictions. They test the hypothesis, and then they iterate on that. If the hypothesis can be borne out by repeatable tests, then we can determine that the hypothesis accurately describes the world in which we live. So, what about evolution? With evolution, we have a theory based on observations, but without true experimentation. So, let me explain. For me, evolution could be understood fully in a scientific sense if we could perform experiments where we could produce evolution right in front of us. So specifically, if we could show certain types of animals morphing into other types of animals. So my observation is that there are many types of animals in the world. My problem is I don't know where all the different kinds of animals come from. And my hypothesis is that genetic mutations under pressure by natural selection can cause animals to change from one type to another. I predict that the entirely new and entirely functional and entirely useful systems will come into being in a given environment, and through some type of experiment that introduces random chance mutations, I show that this happens repeatedly. Now, if we had an experiment like that could show repeated transitions from one type of animal to another, not on the small scale within fruit flies, from one small type of fruit fly to another small type of fruit fly, but at a large level, then I would consider evolution science, right? True science. But the problem is there's not an experiment that can do this, right? We can't create an experiment that shows evolution happening. We cannot repeat the process of evolution. So the hypothesis that some people have come up with is that it takes many generations, even thousands or millions of years, to create one type of animal from another through many sequences of mutations and etc. Well, that's fine for a hypothesis, but that doesn't, we really can't call evolution true science then, right? Because it's not a scientific method that you can apply to it. Now, there is a different category, I think, that we could apply here. Maybe something called forensic science. So with forensics, what you're looking at is something that happened in the past, and you're looking for clues to help you figure out what happened. So, for instance, a forensic crime scene. Forensic scientists or specialists can't perform an experiment to recreate what happened, but they can try best to figure out, what happened. Sometimes they're successful and they have enough evidence to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt about what happened. But, sometimes they don't. with evolution, forensics evolutionary, a forensics evolutionary model is a much better description of what's happening, what we're doing. We're not able to perform an experiment to recreate what is thought to have happened, but we are able to look for clues from what was left behind. So the question is this: is the evidence comprehensive enough to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that random mutations under pressure by natural selection actually made all of the diversity of life that we see today? That question introduces a much different posture than a statement by someone stating that evolution is a known fact of science. Okay, but let's go further. I would say that for most people, they have not taken the time to dig into the specifics, right? They understand the basics of the conclusions of evolutionary ideology, but they don't really know the assumptions required for the process. They don't understand the components required. They don't understand the required initial conditions, etc. They know the conclusions, but the rest of it is filled in with faith. Faith in the scientific community, faith in the experts in other fields of study, etc. But let's think even further beyond the general public. What about evolutionary forensic scientists themselves? Surely they don't have a faith in evolution. Surely they know the facts of evolution, right? Well, first, two things. One, surprisingly, when you get into some of the details, some of the leaders of those respective fields, many of them have actually started to realize some of the very difficult challenges of evolutionary theory. One scientist was quoted at how astounded he was with the apparent necessity of the parallel evolution of the eye in different types of animals. According to some evolutionists, the eye supposedly couldn't have branched from a common ancestor across different types of creatures, in fish versus land animals. So it would have had to have evolved in parallel. Others have since disputed that idea. Now, there isn't really much of a consensus, and no one really knows how it came to be, but everyone is sure that it evolved. Well, that's faith, right? Let's discuss, that's sort of the definition of faith. We don't know how, but we just know. All right, so how about something a little different? Male and female reproductive organs. Okay, in this case, there's a necessity for separate evolutionary processes happening essentially at the same time, and yet they must evolve in such a way as to function together, to fit together perfectly in a system that works. Beyond that, it's the mechanism for recombination of genes. The reproductive system enables that recombination of genes, which is where mutations are more likely to occur in the first place, etc. Look, it takes a lot of faith to believe in a simultaneous evolutionary process of the male and female reproductive organs. Okay. Now, some of the experts are realizing that life itself most likely didn't spring from a single evolutionary tree. But they're citing something they call an evolutionary forest of sorts. So while the textbooks are still stuck, with this tree of evolution, the single tree of evolution, they're teaching that. That's not necessarily what everybody in the leadership of the evolutionary fields are even believing anymore. So that looks like faith, right? We have almost a dogma kind of coming into existence. Okay, secondly, it's surprising how often a key assumption or problem is deferred to another field of science entirely. I'm going to talk about more about that later, but it happens within the leaders of the evolutionary thought, right? One leader of one very specific area, biology and certain types of plants or animals, will just say, well, we don't know how this particular thing worked, but we know that from geology that this is how this is. And then the geologists might say the same thing and point to the biologists for their evidence for how some of the problems that they are viewing or seeing came to be. So I'll get into more on that later. But finally, I want to say another thing, that just because something could have happened doesn't necessarily mean it actually did happen. So with evolution, we have this theory that explains how something could have happened, right? But the chances of it actually happening the way that we say that it happened are infinitely small. So the idea is, well, we're here, so therefore it must have happened. Well, yes, we are here, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it must have happened, right? Okay, so you think there's a chance, right? So you're telling me there's a chance. All right, anyways, faith fills in the rest of the blanks, that it did actually happen that way, right? Now, to make it as clear as I can, if we knew the sequence of mutations that led to each addition of each functional system in the human body, there wouldn't be a need for faith, right? We would know that mutations happened in this sequence and we would see it, right? But we don't have that information. So there's faith. And in fact, there's a lot of it, right? We think that all these systems came to be, and we just take it on faith. Okay. In fact, the scientific journals become sort of like a Bible. Nobody really reads them, but they definitely accept them. The teaching on the subject in schools, almost like I said, becomes dogma. Even though it's outdated, people still adhere to it and teach it religiously. It's never to be challenged, and even mockery or fervor becomes the go-to methodology for squashing any dissent, right? You might think this is strong wording, but if I've ever seen religious fervor, I feel like it's from current evolutionary forensic scientists today. No challenge can be allowed, or else you'll be pushed to the side. All right, so all of this comes without any true observational scientific methodology. We don't have observational science of this happening. It's forensic. Now, in the end, I would say that evolution is solidly in the same category as religion. We can't prove the existence of God or evolution, and we cannot devise an experiment to show either in action. But we can observe information and make leaps of faith to determine what we believe is true, to how this diversity of life came to be. So there you go. That's my case, or at least a start to why I think that evolution is a form of faith. And we're both on the same footing when we start talking about, is Jesus true, or is evolution, atheism, agnosticism true? Is God real? Is God not real? I think it's faith in both cases. So people of faith, let's have a conversation, and I look forward to hammering out the details in the comments.